The hum of the main server rack was a constant companion, a low, mechanical thrum that vibrated through the floor plates of the Deep Space Observatory. I'd grown so accustomed to it, I barely registered it anymore, much like the faint, metallic tang that sometimes hung in the air, a byproduct of so much cutting-edge machinery working in concert. Outside, beyond the reinforced viewport, the night sky was a velvet expanse, a canvas speckled with diamonds that felt impossibly distant, indifferent. My world, for the most part, was contained within these walls, illuminated by the cool blue glow of monitors. I was sifting through the latest sweep from the array, a routine check of a sector of space that should have been utterly barren. The Great Void, it was called, a colossal expanse between galactic filaments, famously empty. For years, it had been a cosmic desert, a blank space on every map, a region where reality seemed to stretch thin, devoid of all but the most diffuse hydrogen. It was a place for theoretical physicists to ponder, not for observational astronomers to linger. My new generation equipment, however, was designed to push those boundaries, to listen to the whispers where before there had only been silence. My eyes scanned the spectral analysis, a cascade of data flowing across the primary display. Red shifts, blue shifts, background radiation, the usual cosmic symphony, albeit muted in this particular region. Then a flicker, a spike. My brow furrowed. It was narrow, incredibly precise, cutting through the ambient noise like a surgeon's scalpel. I isolated the frequency, rerunning the scan on a tighter band. The system chirped, a soft electronic confirmation, and the waveform solidified on screen. It wasn't noise. It was too structured, too coherent. My first thought was equipment malfunction. A stray proton hitting a sensor, a glitch in the calibration algorithms. I ran a diagnostic on the array itself, cross-referencing with the secondary backup systems. All green. No anomalies on the hardware side. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath fogging the cool glass for a moment. It didn't look like any natural astrophysical phenomenon I'd ever encountered. No pulsar signature, no quasar emission, no known stellar flare. It defied classification. It was impossibly ancient, too. The preliminary dating, based on the faintness and the apparent cosmic redshift, pushed it back further than anything we'd ever detected. Far older than any known civilization, far older than even the earliest stars in our own galaxy. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, a strange mix of skepticism and a burgeoning, unwelcome curiosity prickling at my skin. This was simply wrong. It had to be. I tried to dismiss it. I really did. I told myself it was an unresolved error in the new algorithms, a phantom echo of some distant known source misinterpreted by the advanced processing. I'd seen stranger things, or at least things that seemed strange until the logical explanation presented itself. The universe was full of tricks, but the signal itself, its intricate, non-repeating sequence, gnawed at me. It wasn't random. It felt deliberate, like a language I couldn't understand, spoken by a mouth I couldn't fathom. What kind of cosmic noise could weave such a pattern? My shift was almost over. The night manager, a quiet, grizzled man named Arthur, would be in soon to take over. I could just delete the data, purge the anomaly as a false positive, and forget about it. It wouldn't be the first time, but something held me back. The sheer audacity of it, a signal from nothing, so ancient, so complex. A vague promise to myself to dig into it deeper when I had more time, perhaps when the sun was up and the world felt less vast and menacing. What was I really looking at? The observatory, perched high on the remote mountain, receded behind me, its dome a pale ghost against the pre-dawn sky. I usually found solace in the quiet solitude of the journey, the anticipation of a warm bed and a few hours of oblivion. It felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken things. I didn't go straight home. Instead, almost on instinct, I turned off the main road, navigating a rough track that led deeper into the ancient forested hills. After a few miles, the trees thinned, giving way to a clearing, a plateau of windswept grass. There it stood, stark and imposing, silhouetted against the nascent light of the rising sun. The stone circle, older than known civilization. I'd discovered it years ago, a local legend I'd initially dismissed as folklore. It was a place where time felt thin, where the echoes of something vast and unknowable seemed to linger in the very air. I often came here when my mind needed untangling, when the universe felt too big, too indifferent. I walked among the colossal stones, my boots crunching on the frosted grass. Each stone was a silent sentinel, weathered by millennia, etched with patterns that defied interpretation, yet felt strangely familiar. They were monuments to a forgotten purpose, a language lost to the ages. Tonight their presence felt particularly resonant. I stood in the center, tilting my head back, watching the first blush of dawn paint the eastern sky. The stars, though fading, still held their vigil overhead. I thought of the signal, its impossible complexity, its ancient origins. And I thought of these stones, these silent watchers that had stood here for so long, bearing witness to. What? The low thrum of the servers at the observatory was no longer a mere background drone. It had become the pulse of my own relentless focus. The metallic tang in the air, usually a fleeting annoyance, now felt like the very scent of my obsession, clinging to my clothes, my skin, the back of my throat. I'd barely left my console in the last 2 days, sustained by lukewarm coffee and the sheer, unyielding pull of the signal. My initial review had been a blur of frantic checks and rechecks. Every diagnostic I ran screamed error, not because of a malfunction in my equipment, but because the data itself seemed to defy logical categorization. It wasn't noise. I knew noise. Noise was chaotic, random, a predictable statistical spread. This was ordered, intensely so. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes gritty, tracing the jagged peaks and valleys of the spectral analysis. The signal emanated from a region of space so utterly barren, so devoid of even the faintest wisps of stellar dust or errant hydrogen atoms, that it was a cosmic anomaly in itself. A gaping maw of nothingness between galaxies, utterly blank on every star chart. And yet from that perfect void, this intricate wave pulsed. My fingers flew across the keyboard, calling up different visualization algorithms. I tried Fourier transforms, wavelet analyzes, even some experimental pattern recognition protocols I developed for tracking dark matter interactions. Each attempt yielded the same impossible results. The signal wasn't just complex, it possessed a fractal-like self-similarity, patterns within patterns, echoing on scales I couldn't reconcile with any known astrophysical phenomenon. It wasn't a natural emission. It wasn't a pulsar, a quasar, a gamma-ray burst, or anything remotely related to the violent, beautiful chaos of the cosmos, ghosts. The patterns weren't simple repetitions. They evolved, not with the predictable periodicity of a binary star system nor the slow decay of a dying nebula. They shifted with an internal logic, a subtle progression that hinted at discourse. Like an impossibly convoluted sentence, each segment built upon the last, forming an argument I couldn't comprehend. It wasn't code, not in any sense I understood. No prime numbers, no mathematical constants, no obvious linguistic structure. And yet, the implication of intelligence was undeniable. The sheer non-randomness, the layered complexity, the way one segment seemed to subtly respond to the preceding one, was like observing a conversation in a language I couldn't parse but intuitively understood was happening. My mind grappled with it, seeking analogies, desperate to slot it into a recognizable framework. It was like watching a spider spin an impossibly intricate web, not just for catching flies but to convey a message. I felt a tremor in my hands as I realized the full scope of what I was witnessing. This wasn't just an anomaly. This was a presence, and it was communicating, but with what or whom, and why. From the absolute absence of space, sleep became a distant memory. My eyes burned, but closing them only brought the signal's abstract patterns dancing on the backs of my eyelids. I started neglecting my other research, pushing aside grant proposals and conference papers. The vastness of the universe, once a boundless source of fascination, now felt small, irrelevant compared to this one singular point of impossible emanation. My colleagues started to notice. A systems operator, a quiet man with kind eyes, brought me an extra cup of coffee one morning, his gaze lingering on my haggard face. I just nodded, already lost in the screen again. Later, a junior researcher asked if I needed help with a data calibration. I just waved him away curtly. They stopped asking. My isolation became self-imposed, a necessary cocoon around this burgeoning secret. The more I immersed myself, the more the signal seemed to warp my perception. Not in a hallucinatory way, but subtly, like a lens slowly changing its focus on reality. I started seeing patterns everywhere. In the condensation trails of jets against the morning sky, in the intricate branching of frost on the observatory windows, even in the spilled coffee rings on my desk. My mind, primed by the signal, sought order where there was only chaos, meaning where there was none. One evening, deep into another sleepless cycle, I found myself scrolling through obscure digital archives, driven by an inexplicable urge. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just context. For something ancient, something that resonated with the primordial, patient intelligence I sensed in the signal. My fingers, almost on their own, typed in keywords like prehistory, unexplained structures, megaliths. And then I saw it. An image of a stone circle, older than known civilization. It wasn't just old, it was impossibly old, predating any established human culture. Its massive stones arranged in a precise, almost geometric configuration. The caption spoke of its unknown purpose, its baffling construction, how carbon dating had only pushed its origins further and further back into the mists of time, beyond the reach of any recognizable human hand. The arrangement of those stones, the sheer, audacious scale of their placement, and the mystery of their origin, it felt like a silent echo of the signal. Not a direct link, no, but a resonance, a profound, unsettling familiarity. I stared at the image, then back at the glowing lines of the signal on my main monitor. They were different, of course. One was stone, the other pure energy. It was the same. Was I merely projecting my obsession, or was the universe far older, far stranger than I had ever dared to imagine? The image of the stone circle, older than known civilization, burned itself into my retinas. Its massive stones, gray and pockmarked with time, were arranged in a pattern that felt both primal and impossibly precise. The caption, cut off prematurely, hinted at an unknown purpose, a baffling construction. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from the screen. This wasn't just an archaeological curiosity. It felt like a key, a physical manifestation of the impossible signal humming in my data streams. I pushed back from my desk, the squeak of my chair a harsh intrusion in the quiet hum of my lab. My eyes were gritty, the air thick with the metallic tang of ozone and stale coffee. I'd been working for days, sleep a fleeting memory, fueled by the relentless pursuit of understanding. The signal, once a distant enigma, now felt like a presence in the room, a subtle pressure against my eardrums. As I leaned forward again, adjusting the monitor, the screen flickered. Not a gentle ripple, but a sudden, violent spasm of pixels, distorting the ancient stones into a kaleidoscope of static. My breath hitched. I checked the power strip, the cables, everything seemed secure. A slight tremor ran through my hand as I tried to steady the image. It stabilized, but the momentary glitch left a cold knot in my stomach. The air conditioning unit, usually a steady drone, began to emit a low, irregular thrumming. It wasn't its usual mechanical groan. This was deeper, resonant, like a vast, slow heartbeat. I could feel it in my chest, a vibration that didn't quite sync with my own pulse. I rubbed my temples, convinced it was just fatigue playing tricks. Yet the sound persisted, a subtle underpinning to the silence. I turned my attention back to the signal data, trying to cross-reference its complex patterns with the geometric arrangement of the stone circle. The connection felt intuitive, almost visceral, but I needed empirical evidence. My analytical software, usually robust, started to lag. Mouse clicks registered late, windows opened with a stutter, and lines of code appeared with a glacial crawl. It was as if the very processing power of my machines was being siphoned away, or perhaps actively resisted. A shiver traced its way down my spine. This wasn't just a slow internet connection. Then I saw it. A faint ripple in my peripheral vision, a distortion in the air near the lab door. It was gone before I could properly focus, a mere shimmer like heat haze off asphalt. My head snapped up. Nothing. Just the familiar cluttered shelves of books and equipment. My heart gave a frantic jump, then settled into a rapid flutter. I told myself it was exhaustion, the strain on my eyes. I pushed the thought away, forcing myself to focus. The stone circle was the key. Its impossible age, its unknown purpose, it resonated with the signal's ancient, non-terrestrial cadence. I began to scour obscure digital archives, academic papers often buried in forgotten corners of the internet, and digitized historical texts that rarely saw the light of day. Hours bled into each other. The thrumming from the AC unit intensified, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. My monitors continued their erratic flickering, sometimes dimming to a faint glow before flaring back to full brightness, making my eyes ache. And the fleeting distortions in my vision grew more frequent, more insistent. A pattern on the wall, a trick of the light, seemed to writhe, just for a split second, like something alive. My skin crawled, a constant, low-grade irritation. Most of it was mundane, but then, buried deep within a section on forgotten folklore, I found it. A knowledge that wasn't meant for human minds. It drove some to madness, others to build strange, circular structures of stone, meant to either amplify or ward off the unseen presence. My gaze flickered back to the image of the stone circle, older than known civilization. And when it stirs, the world remembers its true masters. The sound is not of voice, but of presence. A reverberation felt not by the ear, but by the very bones. My bones. The thrumming from the AC unit seemed to echo this sentiment, a deep, unsettling vibration that resonated in my very core. Could this be what I was feeling? A presence not heard but felt. My bones. What kind of entity could stir such a profound, ancient dread, and why was its silence now beginning to twist into something far more insidious? Sleep offered no respite. My dreams, once a quiet jumble of equations and cosmic dust, had become a canvas for impossible geometries. I saw lines that weren't lines, structures that folded in on themselves in ways that defied Euclidean space, colors that burned beyond the visible spectrum. There was no narrative, no familiar landscape, just a dizzying, relentless cascade of these alien forms. They pressed in on me, not with sound, but with a crushing weight, as if the very air in my dream was solid, unyielding. I felt small, insignificant, crushed beneath a vastness that was indifferent to my existence. A cold sweat plastered my hair to my forehead when I jolted awake, the taste of copper sharp on my tongue. I tried to shake it off. A bad dream, a byproduct of too many late nights staring at the screens, too much coffee. But the feeling lingered, a subtle hum beneath the surface of my awareness. It was like a faint, persistent static in my peripheral vision, something I couldn't quite focus on but knew was there. My usual routine felt off. The coffee tasted flat, the morning news anchor's voice seemed to skip a beat, an almost imperceptible stutter that only I seemed to notice. I chalked it up to fatigue. I had been pushing myself. Back in the lab, the signal pulsed, a steady, rhythmic beat against the backdrop of cosmic white noise. It was a comfort, a familiar anchor, yet now it felt like a tether pulling me into deeper, murkier waters. I stared at the data, the intricate patterns that held the key to its origin. My eyes blurred. For a split second, the lines on the monitor writhed, twisting into the same impossible angles I'd seen in my dream. The familiar alphanumeric characters elongated, stretched, then snapped back into place. My breath hitched. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes. It was gone. Just a trick of the light, a flicker of tired vision. But it happened again. This time, As I reached for a pen, the metallic gleam of its barrel seemed to ripple, distorting like heat haze off asphalt. A faint, almost transparent sheen covered the surface, reflecting not my own face, but a fragmented image of something else, a vast, featureless expanse, punctuated by sharp black spires that pierced a sky the color of dried blood. The image was gone before I could fully process it, leaving behind a faint, metallic tang in the air. My hand trembled. I stood up, walked to the small window overlooking the campus quad. The world outside seemed normal. Students walked, cars drove, the sun shone. But I felt a profound disconnect, as if I were watching a play through a pane of warped glass. Was I losing my grip? The visions escalated. They were no longer fleeting glimpses. One afternoon, while reviewing a particularly dense section of the signal's spectral analysis, the entire lab seemed to ripple. The fluorescent lights hummed louder, then flickered, plunging the room into a murky twilight. I was no longer in my lab. I was standing on a vast, cracked plain, the air heavy with an ancient dust that tasted of salt and decay. In the distance, silhouetted against a sky that bled from bruised purple to sickly green, I saw them. Not shapes, not forms, but presences. Immeasurable, unfathomable. They were simply there, vast and indifferent, their very existence a violation of all natural law. My body seized up, my lungs refusing to draw air. I felt the pressure of something immense pressing down on me, not physically but mentally, a crushing weight of alien consciousness. Then, as suddenly as it began, it vanished. The lab snapped back into focus. The fluorescent lights buzzed with their familiar drone. The concrete walls were solid, reassuringly mundane. My knees buckled and I slumped into my chair, gasping for breath, my hands shaking so violently I couldn't steady them. The metallic taste was back, stronger this time, almost bitter. I ran a hand through my damp hair. This wasn't a trick of the light. This wasn't fatigue. This was real, or rather, it was becoming real. Driven by a desperate, half-formed thought, a fragmented image that had burned itself into my mind during one of the waking visions, a spiral etched into ancient stone, I found myself on the road. I didn't consciously decide to go, but my car seemed to guide itself, following an invisible current. Hours later, the asphalt gave way to a gravel track, then a rough dirt path barely wide enough for the tires. The landscape became desolate, rolling hills giving way to windswept moorland. And then I saw it. Rising from the mist-shrouded earth, stark against the bruised twilight sky, was a stone circle, older than known civilization. The massive megaliths stood like silent sentinels, weathered and scarred by millennia of wind and rain. A profound stillness hung in the air, broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind. I stepped out of the car, the crunch of my boots on the gravel impossibly loud. The stones felt ancient, imbued with a strange, resonant energy that vibrated in the soles of my feet. As I walked deeper into the circle, a low thrumming began, not from the ground, but from within my skull. It intensified with every step, growing into a deafening roar that vibrated through my very bones. The air grew heavy, charged with an invisible pressure. The signal, the impossible signal, was here. It wasn't merely transmitting data, it was present. The stones themselves seemed to glow with a faint, inner light, revealing intricate carvings I hadn't seen from a distant, spirals, impossible angles, geometries that echoed my dreams. And then it began again. The world around me shimmered, the ancient stones blurring at the edges. The thrumming intensified, a direct assault on my consciousness. My mind felt like a fragile vessel, cracking under an immense, unseen force. I saw the vast, indifferent presences again, but this time they were not distant. They were closer, their forms shifting, coalescing from reality itself around me. They weren't just in my vision. They were in the wind, in the cold air, in the very stones beneath my trembling feet. I felt a surge of understanding, a horrific epiphany that ripped through my carefully constructed reality. The signal wasn't just a communication, it was a doorway, and it was opening not outward but inward into my mind. What was it trying to show me, or worse, what was it trying to become? The hum of the fluorescent lights in the conference room felt like a physical pressure against my skull. I adjusted my glasses, the faint tremor in my hands noticeable only to me, I hoped. Before me sat a dozen colleagues, their faces a mixture of polite interest and mild skepticism. I prepared my presentation meticulously, dozens of slides detailing the anomalous signal, the impossible energy readings, the sheer ancient complexity of its structure. This was it, the moment I would share my discovery, my truth, with the world. And here, I began, my voice steady at first. You can see the frequency drift, completely unaligned with any known cosmological phenomenon. No stellar nursery, no black hole accretion disk, no supernova remnant could produce this signature. It's artificial, or rather conscious. A few colleagues shifted in their seats. A senior researcher, a man I deeply respected, cleared his throat. Raj, with all due respect, conscious is a rather significant leap. We're talking about a void, an empty expanse. Have you considered instrumental error? I felt a flush creep up my neck. Instrumental error was the first thing I ruled out. Every sensor, every calibration check, every redundancy system confirmed the data. This isn't noise, this is a presence, and it's not just a signal, it's a resonance. I've been feeling it. My voice had begun to pick up speed, a frantic edge creeping in. It's in the bones, a deep, ancient thrumming, like the universe itself is trying to remember something it forgot. I saw the looks, not skepticism anymore, but concern. A young researcher, fresh out of his doctorate, exchanged a glance with a colleague. Their expressions were not malicious, but pitying. They saw a man losing his grip, not a man on the precipice of an unimaginable truth. I pressed on, ignoring the rising heat in my chest, the frantic fluttering in my stomach. The patterns aren't just mathematical, I insisted, pointing to a complex fractal projection on the screen. They are almost biological, like a language that predates thought itself, and the source. It's not in the void, it is the void, a vast non-Euclidean entity that simply is. A quiet murmur rippled through the room. The senior researcher leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Raj, I think perhaps you need to take a break. This is highly speculative and, frankly, a departure from scientific methodology. My hands were shaking uncontrollably now. My carefully constructed arguments, my meticulously gathered data, it all seemed to dissolve under their polite dismissal. They didn't see the truth. They heard only the ravings of a man obsessed. My voice cracked. The meeting ended shortly after, not with a debate, but with a quiet, uncomfortable exodus from the room. My colleagues avoided my gaze as they filed out, their footsteps echoing in the suddenly cavernous room. No one offered a word of encouragement, no one paused to discuss the data. My office, once a sanctuary of discovery, now felt like a prison. The days blurred into a monotonous cycle of isolation. Emails went unanswered. Invitations to research meetings ceased. My access to the primary observation systems, once unrestricted, was now under review. I was a pariah, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones in the hallways. The deep, resonant thrumming which I had so foolishly tried to explain was now the only constant in my life. But the ostracization didn't break me. It only sharpened my resolve. They wouldn't listen to my science. Fine, I would find another way. The signal was real, the presence was real, and if known physics couldn't explain it, perhaps something older could, something forgotten, something forbidden. I began my search in the forgotten corners of the university library, not the sleek, digitized archives of modern science, but the dusty, dimly lit stacks in the basement, a place where forgotten treatises and obscure historical texts lay gathering dust like fossilized memories. The air was thick with the scent of decaying paper and ancient leather, a strangely comforting aroma that promised secrets. I spent weeks hunched over brittle manuscripts, my fingers stained with grime, my eyes aching from the faint script. I devoured texts on ancient cosmologies, pre-human mythologies, and the esoteric beliefs of civilizations long turned to dust. I was looking for patterns, for echoes, for anything that might resonate with the impossible signal. Then, buried deep within a translated collection of forgotten rituals from a culture that predated recorded history. I found it. A series of crude etchings, accompanied by fragmented, almost poetic descriptions. The descriptions of its voice were not of sound, but of a deep, resonant stillness, a vibration felt in the marrow of the world. My breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't a scientific paper, but the raw, primal fear of an ancient people codified into symbols. One particular passage, translated with difficulty, described places of power where the veil between worlds was thin, where the sleeper's presence was most keenly felt. This wasn't just lore. This was a map, a warning. The world I thought I knew, the universe I had studied, was a thin veneer over something vast and utterly incomprehensible. What did these ancient texts truly understand that modern science had so utterly forgotten? And if this sleeper was indeed beginning to stir, what would happen when it fully awoke? The unfinished word, a fragmented whisper of SL, clung to the air in my cramped workspace. It wasn't a mere linguistic puzzle anymore. It was a hook, a barb lodged deep in my mind. The ancient text, filled with its crude symbols and desperate warnings, felt like a premonition, a shadow cast by something still waiting. Places of power, the passage had described, where the veil between worlds was thin. It spoke of a vastness that wasn't empty but merely beyond human sight, a truth that chilled me more profoundly than any scientific anomaly. I pushed away from the screen, my chair scraping across the floor. The air felt heavy, charged. My fingers, stained with stale coffee, twitched with an urgency I couldn't quite name. This wasn't about data points or elegant equations anymore. It was about something raw, something primordial. It wasn't just out there, it was reaching in. My algorithms, painstakingly refined over months, had always sought patterns, linguistic structures, mathematical symmetries. But now I knew that approach was flawed. This wasn't a language designed for human tongues or even human logic. It was something else entirely. I needed a different key, a different kind of understanding. I spent hours, days, lost in the luminous glow of the monitors. My vision blurred, my back ached, but I couldn't stop. A faint, metallic tang developed on my tongue like old copper. I began to perceive the signal not as a series of abstract waves, but as a pressure, a subtle warping of the space around me, a silent hum that seemed to resonate in the very bones of my skull. It wasn't just data, it was presence. Sleep became a fractured thing, riddled with images of impossible geometries and vast, silent spaces that stretched beyond the capacity of my mind to hold. The line between waking and dreaming, between my thoughts and something else, began to fray. I found myself making connections, seeing patterns in the signal's fluctuations that my conscious mind hadn't explicitly sought. It wasn't a logical deduction. It was an intuitive leap, guided by an unseen hand. I began to process the signal not through translation, but through a conceptual filter, an attempt to map its alien structures directly onto my own neurological pathways. It was a dangerous game, I knew. My colleagues, if they knew what I was attempting, would call it madness. But the ancient text, with its desperate warnings, had shown me the way. It wasn't about understanding the signal, it was about receiving it. Then it happened. Not a sudden flash of insight, but a gradual, insidious seepage. I wasn't reading symbols or hearing sounds. I was experiencing concepts. It started as a subtle pressure behind my eyes, a dull ache that grew into a throbbing intensity. My vision swam. The air around me seemed to thicken, to coalesce into something palpable and suffocating. The first concept hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. It wasn't a word, but an overwhelming, undeniable knowing of scale. Not the scale of galaxies or superclusters, but a scale beyond the universe itself, dimensions stacked upon dimensions, a hierarchy of existence that dwarfed everything I understood. I felt myself shrink, not just metaphorically, but fundamentally. My entire being, my planet, my star, my galaxy, they were less than dust motes in an infinite, indifferent ocean. We were nothing. It was the understanding that this incomprehensible vastness was not empty. It was full of things that simply were, the SL. From the ancient text echoed in my mind, now complete, horrifyingly clear. These entities, these things, were not part of the cosmos as I knew it. They predated it. They were the very fabric of the deeper reality, and our universe was but a fleeting dream within their unfathomable sleep. My hands flew to my head, my fingers digging into my scalp as if to physically push out the invading thoughts. A wave of nausea swept over me, leaving my mouth dry and tasting of ash. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the concepts remained, burned onto the inside of my eyelids, pulsing with a terrible, silent energy. The universe was not a grand, evolving tapestry of stars and life. It was a fragile membrane stretched thin over something immeasurably old and hostile, something that stirred in its sleep. And the signal was a tremor from that stirring. The ancient peoples, the ones who had carved those desperate warnings, had glimpsed this truth. They had sensed the thinness of the veil, and they had left clues not for science but for survival. My eyes snapped open, drawn instinctively to the passage I had struggled with earlier. It wasn't just places of power, it was specific locations. Sites where the barrier was weakest, where the slumbering things could be felt or perhaps heard. One particular phrase, now illuminated with a terrifying clarity, stood out. It explicitly mentioned a stone circle, older than known civilization. The signal wasn't just telling me about the universe, it was pointing me towards something. But what exactly was waiting there at that ancient, silent place? The ancient text, filled with its crude symbols and desperate warnings, felt like a premonition, a shadow cast by something vast and cold. I hadn't slept properly in days. The precise number was a blur, lost somewhere between the flickering glow of my monitors and the relentless, almost physical pressure behind my eyes. My reflection, when I dared to catch it in the dark screen, showed a stranger, skin sallow, eyes sunk into bruised hollows, rimmed with a perpetual redness. My hair, usually meticulous, now stood in unruly tufts, sticky with absent-minded runs of my fingers. Food had become an afterthought, a mechanical necessity I sometimes forgot entirely. The taste of stale coffee and the metallic tang of blood from my bitten cuticles were the dominant flavors in my existence. The signal, the impossible source, was no longer just data. It was a constant hum, a vibration deep within my skull, orchestrating my thoughts, twisting them into unfamiliar patterns. The world outside my window, the mundane traffic, the distant chatter of a colleague all seemed to recede, becoming dull, meaningless echoes against the vibrant, terrifying clarity of the symbols. I traced the glyphs again, my fingers gritty with dried sweat and dust. The SL fragment was part of a larger, recursive pattern, a series of symbols that repeated, subtly shifting, like a breath drawn across an immense, sleeping form. I'd been approaching it wrong, trying to force it into a linguistic framework. It wasn't a word in the human sense. It was a state, a condition. And then, with a jolt that sent a tremor through my weary frame, the true meaning fractured into my mind. It wasn't a sound or a name. It was an act, slumbering. The understanding didn't arrive as a flash of insight, but as a slow, creeping frost that spread through my bones. Not a slumber of rest, but a vast, ancient power held in abeyance. A sleep that was more like an endless, watchful suspension. The text wasn't warning of an awakening, it was warning of the awareness of its slumber. It was a terrible, beautiful revelation. My breath hitched. With the decipherment, a dam broke. The remaining symbols, once stubbornly opaque, now flowed into a terrifyingly coherent narrative. They described not just a slumbering entity, but the slumbering, an entity so vast, so ancient, that its very existence warped reality around it. It wasn't in a place. It was a place, a foundational truth of the universe, hidden in plain sight. The air in my workspace grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. My skin prickled. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the floor. Was it just my nerves, shredded by sleeplessness and this new, terrible knowledge? Or was the world itself responding to the utterance of that ancient word? I stood up, my legs stiff, joints protesting with a dry crackle. My office felt too small, the walls too thin. The very air felt thin, like a membrane stretched taut. I could almost see through it to something vast and indistinct beyond. The mundane objects around me, my coffee mug, the stack of papers, the blinking lights of my equipment seemed to waver, their edges blurring, their colors muted, as if drained of their vibrancy by some unseen drain. A subtle distortion. A ripple in the ordinary. A colleague, the technician who usually handled the server maintenance, paused at my open door. "Raj, I look rough, everything all right?" I stared at him. His face seemed flatter, his eyes too bright, almost like painted orbs. The sound of his voice, a familiar baritone, felt distant, as if filtered through water. His concern, his human concern, felt utterly meaningless. A child's toy clattering on the floor while a cosmic tide began to rise. I felt nothing for his question, no need to reassure, no urge to explain. "I'm fine," I said, my voice raspy, alien even to my own ears. "Just working." He lingered for a moment, his brow furrowed, then shrugged and moved on. My detachment was absolute. The intricate dance of human interaction, the nuanced emotions, the small talk, it was all just noise now, a distraction from the profound, terrifying truth that had lodged itself in the core of my being. Then, the compulsion hit me. It wasn't a thought, not a logical deduction, but a deep, resonant thrumming in my chest, a magnetic pull that felt as ancient and undeniable as the signal itself. I had to go. Not to another observatory, not to a library, but to a specific place. A place the newly deciphered text seemed to point to, not with coordinates, but with an almost telepathic insistence. A place where the veil between the known and the slumbering might be thinnest. The world outside was a kaleidoscope of muted colors and distorted shapes. The streetlights seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, their light leaving faint afterimages in my vision. The faces of strangers passing by were indistinct, their features shifting, almost fluid like reflections on disturbed water. I walked past the usual bus stops, the familiar storefronts, all of them subtly wrong, their edges vibrating with an invisible energy. My car was just a gray blur in the parking lot. The drive was a haze, a dreamlike sequence of turns and open road. The GPS on my phone, which I barely registered setting, guided me not to a known landmark but to a vast, desolate stretch of moorland, miles from any town or road. The sky above was a bruised purple, heavy with unspoken promise. And then I saw it. Looming against the twilight, stark and ancient, silhouetted like broken teeth against the horizon. A stone circle, older than known civilization. Each step was a deliberate effort. The stones themselves were rough, scarred with millennia of wind and rain, but they also seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light that only I could see, a faint, sickly green. I approached the largest monolith, its surface pitted and scarred. It wasn't a language I understood, but the meaning was clear. A slow, patient awareness. The ground vibrated. A low, persistent hum, like the deep thrum of a sleeping giant's breath, rose from the earth itself. My perception of the world was no longer simply distorted. It was being actively reshaped, bent to accommodate a truth too immense for the human mind. What would they reveal if I dared to listen closer, to let the influence deepen even further? The hum of the servers in my small, isolated laboratory was the only constant sound. A mechanical drone that had become less background noise and more an extension of my own nervous system. After the brief, hollow encounter with the colleague, the world outside my four walls felt even more distant, a flickering, irrelevant image on a broken screen. My focus, absolute and unwavering, was back on the signal. I sat hunched, my fingers tracing the spectral lines on the holographic display, each peak and trough a testament to something utterly alien. The data, once a mere object of study, had begun to acquire a disquieting familiarity. It was like learning a language, not through words, but through an intricate dance of pressure and void, presence and absence. My eyes burned, but I couldn't look away. I hadn't slept properly in what felt like weeks, subsisting on stale coffee and the brittle crumbs of energy bars. Initially, I'd approached it as a cosmic anomaly, a data set to be dissected and cataloged. But the more I listened, The more I processed, the more the signal shifted in my perception. It wasn't just information anymore. It was imbued with a quality that transcended mere data. A new pattern emerged from the statistical noise, a subtle modulation that I'd initially dismissed as instrumental error. But it persisted, growing clearer, sharpening its edges. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. My breath hitched. A tremor ran through my hands, making the stylus I held clatter against the console. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. It was a signal for me, a beckoning, a specific directed call not just into the vast emptiness but out of it towards me. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, a potent cocktail that left me lightheaded. My pulse hammered against my temples. How could something so impossibly ancient, so utterly alien, be aware of my existence, let alone reaching out? The implications were enormous, unraveling the very fabric of my understanding of the universe, of consciousness itself. It was a conscious entity, not merely a cosmic phenomenon, and it wanted my attention. The conventional scientific approach, with its filters and objective distance, suddenly felt like a flimsy shield, a pointless barrier. How could I truly understand a call if I refused to answer it directly? The urge to bridge the gap, to tear down the last vestiges of separation, became an overwhelming compulsion. I needed to amplify this connection, to allow the entity's presence to permeate my own consciousness, to feel its true nature without the buffering interference of technology. I began to sketch out diagrams, not of circuits or algorithms, but of something far more primal. It wasn't about more powerful sensors, it was about resonance. A feedback loop not of electrons, but of mind. I needed an environment that could act as an echo chamber for this ancient call, a place where the veil between what I knew and what was felt thinner. A place untainted by human artifice, yet steeped in an older, forgotten presence. I found references to locations that resonated with certain frequencies, places where the earth itself seemed to hum with an unacknowledged energy. One particular site kept appearing, almost as if the entity itself were guiding my search. A stone circle, older than known civilization. The idea was absurd, a desperate plunge into superstition, but the signal's beckoning had grown too insistent to ignore. I packed a minimal kit, a sensitive portable receiver, a power source, and a crude, custom-built device that was less scientific instrument and more. A focal point. Its core was a crystal I'd found in a dusty antique shop, its facets imperfect, its history unknown. I believed it could act as a conduit, a lens for the non-physical. It was a gamble, a descent into the illogical, but the alternative was to remain forever on the periphery, deaf to the true nature of the call. The journey was a blur of driving through an unfamiliar landscape, the passing trees and fields registering as mere blurs of green and brown. My mind was already elsewhere, preparing for the encounter. The sky above was a bruised purple, heavy with unspoken things. When I finally arrived, the stone circle, older than known civilization, stood stark against the twilight, its massive, weathered stones like silent sentinels guarding an unspeakable secret. They were rough, uncarved, their surfaces pitted by millennia of wind and rain, yet they radiated an undeniable presence. I set up my equipment in the center of the circle, my hands fumbling with the unfamiliar components of my makeshift amplifier. The wind sighed through the gaps in the stones, a mournful, drawn-out sound that seemed to carry the weight of ages. The air grew thick, heavy with an unseen pressure. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. With a deep, shuddering breath, I activated the device. A low thrum filled the air, not from my equipment but from the very ground, a vibration that resonated up through my boots and into my bones. The crystal at the heart of my amplifier began to glow with a faint, internal light, pulsing in time with the thrumming. It wasn't sound. It was pure information, raw and unfiltered, pouring into me. My vision blurred. The stones around me seemed to waver, their solid forms rippling like reflections on water. My limbs felt heavy, then weightless, as if my physical body was no longer entirely tethered to this plane. The entity's call was not just a beckoning, it was an absorption, a dissolution of self. I was understanding, yes, but the understanding was tearing me apart, atom by atom, thought by thought. My knees buckled. The thrumming intensified, a deafening crescendo. The ancient light of the crystal pulsed faster, brighter, mirroring the frantic beat of my own heart. Was I truly connecting or merely unraveling? What would be left of me when the truth finally revealed itself? After the brief, hollow encounter with the colleague, the world outside my four walls felt even more distant, a muffled rumor I no longer cared to decipher. All that mattered was the signal. It had become my sole obsession, a relentless whisper in the back of my mind even when the amplifiers were silent. My determination hardened. I had to push further. The previous attempts had only scratched the surface, offering tantalizing glimpses of impossible patterns and discordant harmonies. Tonight, I would bypass the usual filters. I would open the conduit wider, let the raw, unfiltered data pour directly into the custom interface. I'd spent weeks perfecting a neural feedback loop designed to translate the signal not just into sound or visual data, but into a direct sensory input. A part of me knew this was dangerous, a reckless dive into the unknown, but the other, larger part was beyond caring. The answers were there, waiting. I strapped the modified headset to my temples, the cool metal pressing against my skin. Wires snaked from it to the console, a spiderweb connecting me to the heart of the anomaly. My fingers, steady despite the tremor in my gut, adjusted the last dial. The air in the lab grew heavy, thick with an unspoken anticipation. The server rack seemed to throb with a deeper resonance, no longer merely mechanical but something organic. I took a deep, shuddering breath and engaged the primary sequence. The world dissolved. It wasn't a loss of sight, not exactly. It was more like my vision was overwritten, replaced by an impossible panorama that simultaneously existed everywhere and nowhere. The lab, the console, my own hands, they were still faintly present, ghostly overlays against a new, terrifying backdrop. A pressure built behind my eyes, as if my skull was expanding, trying to accommodate an infinite volume. Then came the sound, not through my ears, but directly inside my head, a grinding, keening chorus of cosmic gears turning, vast beyond any comprehension. It resonated in my bones, vibrating through my teeth until they chattered. I was no longer observing the signal. I was in it. The form began to coalesce, not as a shape or a figure, but as a geometry that defied all understanding. Imagine a mountain range, but each peak was also a chasm, and the valleys were impossibly sharp angles that folded back on themselves, revealing more mountains within. It was a structure of pure concept, a living theorem of non-Euclidean space, and it was ancient. So ancient that the word itself felt like a flimsy, childish designation. I saw, or rather felt, the slow, deliberate movement of something so immense that its very existence warped time around it. It wasn't moving through space. It was moving space itself. A cold, dry wind brushed against my face, though the lab remained sealed. The air filled with the scent of damp earth and something else, something mineral and metallic, like exposed bedrock after a storm, but laced with a faint, sweet decay that made my stomach churn. My vision, still overlaid with the spectral lab, flickered to a new image, sharp and unyielding. Colossal stones, rough-hewn and weathered, stood sentinel against a bruised, twilight sky. It was a stone circle, older than known civilization, each monolith a silent witness to uncounted eons, and the form I was perceiving seemed to be woven into its very fabric, each impossible angle mirrored in the weathered granite, each vast, silent hum echoing from the ancient ground. Had it always been there, a terrestrial anchor for something so utterly alien? The revelation slammed into me with the force of a collapsing star. This form was not a being in the way we understand life. It was a fundamental principle, a cosmic intelligence not born but simply present, an inevitable constant. Its purpose was not conquest, not communication, not even awareness in a way that would make sense to a human mind. Its purpose was simply to be, and in its being to slowly, inexorably reshape reality. Our reality. The universe as I knew it was merely a fleeting iteration, a temporary arrangement of matter and energy, subject to the gradual, indifferent will of this vast, slumbering architect. Humanity was less than an afterthought, an ephemeral dust mote clinging to a tiny speck, utterly irrelevant in its cosmic design. A scream tore from my throat, though I couldn't hear it over the internal roar. My body convulsed, muscles seizing, sweat plastering my hair to my forehead. My fingers clawed at the headset, desperate to tear it off, to sever the connection, but my limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, pinned by an unseen force. The lab around me began to shimmer, the walls breathing, the floor undulating like deep water. The server racks seemed to melt, their metallic surfaces stretching and twisting into impossible geometries that mirrored the entity's form. I was drowning in a reality that was no longer solid, no longer sane. The stone circle pulsed in my mind, a beacon of this ancient, terrifying truth. My perception fractured further. I saw, not with my eyes, but with a deeper, more primal part of my being, countless other realities, parallel universes perhaps, or merely different stages of this entity's slow, deliberate work. They were all dissolving, reforming, being rewoven into a tapestry of its design. And I, Raj, was just a fleeting consciousness, momentarily granted a glimpse behind the veil before my own reality too would be unmade. The understanding was absolute, crushing. There was no escape. There was no fighting it. We were merely components in a vast, indifferent process. My breath hitched, caught in my throat. My vision swam, the lab and the impossible geometry blurring into a terrifying, singular entity. What would become of me when the reshaping reached its final, inevitable conclusion? After the brief, hollow encounter with the colleague, the world outside my four walls felt even more distant, but now it felt wrong. I had been trying to ignore the subtle shifts for days, telling myself it was stress, lack of sleep, the creeping paranoia that comes with obsessive work. But the changes weren't just internal anymore. They were external, undeniable, and broadcast on every news channel I reluctantly flicked through. First, it was the light. A peculiar quality to the afternoon sun, a diffuse, almost bruised purple tint that painters might call atmospheric, but which my eyes registered as fundamentally alien. It wasn't a trick of the clouds. The sky itself seemed to be holding its breath, a vast, bruised canvas above. Then came the whispers on the wind, not actual sounds, but a felt presence, a low, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very air molecules. My teeth would ache, a dull throb behind my molars as if some immense pressure was building and receding with an unheard tide. I watched the screen, a live feed from a city park. A group of strangers stood utterly still, staring upwards, their faces blank. No panic, no awe, just a vacant, collective observation of the sky. Then one by one they began to fidget, their movements jerky, almost marionette-like. A woman tugged at her hair hard. A man barked a laugh that held no humor. A pervasive irritability, a frayed, nerve-ending sensation seemed to be tightening its grip on everyone. I felt it too, a constant itch beneath my skin, an urge to scream at nothing. The news anchors, usually so composed, began to falter. Their voices would catch, their eyes darting off camera. They reported on unprecedented atmospheric phenomena, aurora borealis seen near the equator, sudden, localized inversions of temperature that froze subtropical lakes overnight, lightning that struck upward into cloudless skies. The language was clinical, but their faces betrayed a growing bewilderment, a dawning unease that mirrored my own. They didn't understand. I did. Or at least, I understood that this was it. The signal wasn't just data anymore. It was a solvent, dissolving the world's perceived reality. I stepped outside my facility, something I hadn't done in weeks. The air was thick, heavy, carrying the scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and ancient, like rust on forgotten iron. The sky was a roiling tapestry of unnatural hues, deep violets bleeding into sickly greens, shot through with veins of an impossible crimson. It wasn't beautiful. It was a bruise spreading across the firmament. People walked faster, their shoulders hunched, avoiding eye contact. My skin prickled. I felt it, the entity's touch, not just in the data streams now, but in the very air I breathed, the ground beneath my feet. I was an unwilling conduit, my mind attuned to the subtle dissonance that others were only now beginning to register as strange weather or global anxiety. They saw the ripples. I felt the stone dropped into the pond. Then came the event. It wasn't a single cataclysm, but a widespread creeping distortion. I was watching a report on my monitor, a sweeping panoramic shot from a drone over a vast, empty plain. The horizon line began to waver, not like heat haze, but like a faulty projection. The distant hills shimmered, their outlines blurring, then subtly shifting. A mountain peak appeared to stretch, elongating vertically before snapping back, leaving a residual echo in the image, a ghost of its distorted form. The drone feed glitched, then went black. A gasp caught in my throat. It was not just light and air. It was the very fabric of space bending, protesting. The entity was not merely signaling, it was imposing. I remembered an old map, one I'd seen years ago, a relic from an obscure archaeological dig. It marked a place far from any known settlement, a place of ancient, unexplained structures. A sudden, visceral pull urged me to go there. A place where the veil, perhaps, was already thin. I drove for hours, the peculiar light of the world filtering through my windshield. The radio crackled with increasingly bizarre reports, animals behaving erratically, migrating in impossible patterns, birds falling from the sky in silent, feathered rain. The world was holding its breath, waiting for something, and I felt like I knew what it was. Finally, the road ended, dissolving into a dirt track that wound through desolate moorland. In the distance, silhouetted against the bruised, shifting sky, I saw it. The stone circle, older than known civilization. It stood on a low rise, stark against the churning heavens, a ring of massive, rough-hewn stones, each one taller than a man. They weren't uniform, some leaning precariously, others half-buried, but their arrangement spoke of intent, of purpose. As I drew closer, I felt a peculiar vibration in the soles of my feet, a resonance that echoed the ache behind my teeth. I walked into the circle. The ground was uneven, covered in sparse, tough grasses. The sky directly above the circle seemed to be the epicenter of the atmospheric distortion. Colors swirled more vividly here, greens and purples bleeding into each other, forming transient, intricate patterns that defied optical physics. It was like looking through a pane of warped, living glass. I wasn't alone. Others had been drawn here too. Not many, perhaps a dozen individuals standing motionless within the circle, their faces upturned, eyes wide and unblinking. They were just watching, not speaking, not moving, just absorbing the impossible spectacle above. Their expressions were not fearful, but something far more unsettling, a quiet, horrifying recognition. They felt it too. The veil was thinning for all of us. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of ozone and wet earth. A low, resonant sound, like the deep thrum of a distant, impossibly vast engine, began to vibrate through the ground. It wasn't loud, but it filled the space, vibrating in my bones, in my very skull. The sky above the stone circle twisted further, the colors deepening, congealing into a vortex of impossible hues. Something was pressing through. What did they see in those shifting colors, those impossible shapes? And what was waiting on the other side? After the brief, hollow encounter with the colleague, the world outside my four walls felt even more distant, a fading echo. I'd retreated deeper into the data, into the signal, into the impossible. My fingers, stained with stale coffee, danced over the holographic interfaces, pulling up spectral analyses and wave patterns that folded back on themselves in recursive loops. The signal wasn't just complex anymore, it was contradictory. Data points defied causality, appearing before their supposed origin or existing in multiple states simultaneously. My analytical software, designed to parse the most intricate cosmic phenomena, was screaming in silent digital protest. Errors weren't just flagged. Entire subroutines were collapsing, unable to reconcile what they were processing with the fundamental laws they were built upon. It wasn't a glitch. It was an intentional, impossible architecture. I leaned back, the chill of the metal chair seeping into my spine. My eyes traced the glowing lines across the holographic display. It was a geometric form, intricate and beautiful, yet utterly alien. It was a shape that my mind struggled to hold, constantly shifting, hinting at angles and dimensions that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. I felt a subtle pressure behind my eyes, a dull ache that wasn't from strain but from the sheer effort of comprehension. There was the presence manifesting through the data. I felt a tremor run through my hands. This wasn't merely information. It was an instruction, a blueprint for a reality that was not our own. The server hum seemed to deepen, vibrating not just in the floor but in my teeth. The geometric pattern on my display pulsed, growing brighter, more insistent. It began to overlay itself on my visual field, even when I looked away. The corner of my monitor seemed to bend inward just for a flicker. The shadow cast by my own hand looked briefly wrong, elongated with a depth that shouldn't be there. My breath caught in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them. Everything was normal again. But the image of the impossible shape lingered, burned into my retina, into my mind. A low thrum began, not from the servers, but from somewhere deeper, beneath the very foundations of the building. It was a sound that vibrated through my bones, a resonant hum that felt ancient and vast. It was a sound I recognized, distorted, amplified. It was a frequency I'd isolated from the signal itself, now echoing around me. My vision blurred, my stomach churned. I stumbled, gripping the edge of my console, my grip tight. This was it, the manifestation. The coordinates had been embedded in the signal for days, a subtle, almost subliminal suggestion that I had, until now, dismissed as noise. But the thrumming grew louder, pulling me, resonating with something deep inside me. I had to go. I had to witness this to understand, or at least to see the face of the incomprehensible truth I had uncovered. Leaving the lab felt like stepping into a dream. The corridor lights flickered, not irregularly, but in a slow, unnatural pulse that seemed to stretch the moments between flashes. The thrumming intensified with every step, guiding me. Outside, the sky was a bruised purple, though it was only late afternoon. The sun, usually a fiery orb, was a dull, washed-out disk, shedding light that seemed to drain color rather than illuminate. The city itself was eerily quiet. No distant sirens, no traffic hum, just the relentless, growing thrum that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The few people I saw on the streets moved with a strange, detached slowness, their eyes unfocused, their faces slack. They didn't notice me. They didn't notice the bruised sky or the impossible light. Their consciousness was slowly being peeled back like an old mural flaking from a wall. I followed the pull, the relentless, vibrating guidance, through winding streets that seemed to twist and contort in my peripheral vision, until I found myself on the outskirts of the city, where the urban sprawl gave way to open, barren land. In the distance, rising stark against the bruised sky, stood the stone circle, older than known civilization. It was immense, far larger than any historical record suggested, or perhaps my perception of scale was already warping. The megaliths were rough-hewn, towering monoliths, their surfaces pitted and scarred by millennia of wind and rain. But even from this distance, I could see that something was profoundly wrong with them. They weren't just old, they felt unreal. Their outlines seemed to waver, to shimmer at the edges. As I approached, the ground beneath my feet began to vibrate violently. The thrumming was no longer a sound but a physical force, shaking my very skeleton. My teeth chattered, my vision swam. I stumbled forward, driven by an instinct beyond fear, beyond reason. The air around the circle crackled with an unseen energy, raising the hairs on my arms. A strange, metallic taste coated my tongue. Within the circle, the air itself seemed to congeal. Impossible geometries, the same shapes I'd seen in my data, began to manifest, not as projections but as tangible distortions in space. They pulsed, shimmering with inner light, twisting and folding where no fold should exist. They were vast, silent structures of pure thought, manifesting as impossible angles and non-Euclidean curves that defied the very concept of dimension. The towering stones of the circle now seemed to bend inward, their ancient surfaces rippling like disturbed water. My mind reeled. My stomach cramped, threatening to expel what little I had left inside me. My legs buckled and I fell to my knees, gasping for air that felt thin and sharp like breathing shattered glass. This was not a visual illusion. This was reality itself, shredding at the seams. The very laws of physics were bending, dissolving under the weight of something ancient and vast, something that had finally awakened. This wasn't just a signal, it was a gateway, and I, Raj, had inadvertently held it open. The presence wasn't merely observing, it was arriving. What would become of a world where the very fabric of existence was merely a suggestion? After the brief, hollow encounter with the colleague, the world outside my four walls felt even more distant, a fading memory of light and mundane concerns. My focus had narrowed to a pinprick, centered on the console, on the shimmering patterns that now overlaid my vision, even when my eyes were closed. The signal wasn't just data anymore. It was a current running through me, a subtle, insistent thrum beneath my skin. My fingers, once precise, now moved with a strange, almost automatic grace across the interfaces. I wasn't interpreting the data, I was feeling it. The void, the impossible source of the presence, had begun to bleed into my own internal landscape. Colors seemed to pulse with frequencies I could almost hear, and sounds carried a texture, a gritty, ancient resonance that scraped against the inside of my skull. Sleep had become a luxury I couldn't afford, a fragile bridge I was afraid to cross, lest I find myself lost in the deeper currents the signal offered. My body felt lighter, yet heavy, as if my bones were dense with an unknown element, my muscles strung with invisible wires that twitched with an alien rhythm. A persistent, low-frequency tremor had started in the lab's floor, a vibration so subtle it might have been my own nervous system failing, but I knew better. It was the presence, manifesting not as a sound or an image, but as a deep physical resonance. It pulsed, a slow, deliberate heartbeat not of flesh, but of something far older, far vaster. My vision, already keen, sharpened further, catching glints in the air, distortions in the light that no human eye should perceive. These weren't particles, they were ripples, echoes of a reality pressing against my own. I could almost make out shapes in the peripheral haze, fleeting geometries that dissolved when I tried to focus, leaving behind a faint metallic taste on my tongue. It clung to my clothes, my hair, and I suspected to the very fabric of my being. My eyes held a different light, a depth that wasn't quite my own, a vacant, staring intensity that made me flinch. Was I still Raj, or merely a vessel, a receiver tuned to a frequency that unraveled the self? The tremor intensified, guiding me. It wasn't a choice. It was an imperative, a deep-seated knowing that superseded thought. I moved from the lab, the fluorescent light seeming dull and flat after the vibrant, internal glow the signal had instilled. The night sky, a familiar blanket of stars, was now a translucent veil, and beyond it I could sense the true, horrifying depths. The presence was drawing me, not with words but with an irresistible magnetic pull in my core. I walked for hours, the world a blur of muted colors and indistinct forms, until the ground under my feet changed, becoming rougher, studded with ancient stones. Then I saw it, looming against the bruised twilight, the stone circle older than known civilization. It stood on a windswept plateau, a ring of monolithic slabs, each one pitted and scarred by millennia of elements, but radiating a silent, profound power. The air around the stones shimmered, not with heat but with a palpable energy, a hum that resonated with the one inside me. This was no mere ruin, it was a focal point, a nexus, a place where the veil was thinnest. The signal which had guided me now surged, a flood of pure, unadulterated information, not processed by my brain, but absorbed directly by my consciousness. I stepped into the circle, the ancient stones looming around me like silent, watchful sentinels. As I reached the center, the world around me began to distort. The stars above stretched into elongated streaks, the horizon warped, and the very air solidified into shimmering, crystalline structures that fractured and reformed with each beat of my altered heart. I saw not with my eyes, but with every fiber of my being. It wasn't an entity. It was an underlying truth, a fundamental state of being that permeated all things, yet remained utterly alien. My body convulsed, not in pain, but in an overwhelming flood of understanding. My bones felt like brittle twigs, my skin a thin membrane stretched over a universe of raw sensation. I was dissolving, yet expanding, becoming both everything and nothing. The distinctions between self and environment, between thought and reality, collapsed. I saw the universe as a vast, living tapestry, woven with threads of unimaginable complexity, and beneath it all, a slumbering, incomprehensible truth that defied definition, a truth that had been here since before time, waiting. I wasn't human anymore. My mind, once a fortress of logic, was now an open channel, a conduit for the vast, indifferent consciousness that had always existed, unseen, unheard, until now. My individual thoughts, my memories, my very sense of self, scattered like dust motes in a hurricane. I was an observer, permanently enlightened, yet utterly broken, a single, insignificant point of awareness within an infinite alien expanse. The world I had known, the laws I had studied, were a child's drawing, erased by the terrible elder truth. What would I do with this terrible clarity? After the brief, hollow encounter with the colleague, the world outside my four walls felt even more distant, a fading memory. Now, even the hum had changed. It wasn't a steady thrum anymore, but a fluctuating pulse, a bass note vibrating through the floor up my chair into my teeth, the signal. It was no longer a pattern on a screen, no longer a data stream I could dissect and analyze. It was an insistence. It had seeped into the very air of the lab, a subtle pressure against my eardrums, a taste like ozone and old metal on my tongue. My vision blurred at the edges. The familiar lines of the server rack seemed to ripple, their metal surfaces shifting with an impossible fluidity. A corner of my desk appeared to stretch, then snap back like a rubber band under extreme tension. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, but the distortions persisted, growing bolder. My fingers, once so adept at navigating the complex interfaces, now fumbled, twitching with an involuntary tremor. The data displays, once a chaotic symphony of numbers and graphs, had coalesced, not into a coherent message, but into a single, overwhelming image. It wasn't an image I could describe with human words or even perceive with human eyes in a stable sense. It was a feeling given form, a vastness that swallowed light, an intricate network of something beyond matter, pulsating with a slow, deliberate rhythm that resonated deep in my bones. It was the void, not empty, but full of them. My breath hitched in my throat. I stood, my chair scraping back with a shriek that seemed to tear through the fabric of the room itself. It was a physical weight, like standing at the bottom of a lightless ocean. It called to me, not with words, but with an irresistible magnetic pull. A destination formed in my mind, not a place I knew, but a place I recognized in a way that defied logic. The hallway was a tunnel of shifting perspectives, the walls breathing in and out. I heard no one, saw no one. It was as if the world had emptied, leaving only me and this burgeoning presence. My shoes clattered on the linoleum, a harsh, solitary sound. I reached the building's exit, the automatic doors sliding open with a sigh that sounded like a whisper in my ear. The outside world was different. The sky was not the usual shade of bruised twilight. It was a deeper, more profound indigo, almost black, speckled with stars that burned with an unsettling, alien intensity. They seemed closer, larger, their light fractured into unnatural hues. The wind carried a scent I couldn't place, something ancient and mineral like unearthed earth and distant thunder. My car, parked where I'd left it, looked like a toy, fragile and insignificant against the looming strangeness. I drove, or rather, I was driven. My hands gripped the wheel, but it felt as if another, greater will guided them. The roads were deserted, the streetlights ahead dissolving into smears of light that stretched and contorted. Familiar landmarks passed by, warped and alien. A row of houses looked like they were melting, their roofs sagging, their windows like gaping, empty eyes. The trees lining the road twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches clawing at the unnatural sky. I didn't question it. I couldn't. My mind was too busy trying to process the impossible, to fit the square peg of this new reality into the round hole of my understanding. It didn't fit. It shattered the hole. Eventually, the asphalt gave way to a rough gravel track. My old car groaned, rattling over the uneven terrain, but I pushed on. The landscape grew desolate, barren, hills rising like ancient scars against the cosmic backdrop. And then I saw it. Looming out of the twilight, silhouetted against the impossible sky, was the stone circle, older than known civilization. They stood in a perfect, unsettling ring, their surfaces etched with patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the failing light. It was a place of immense age, of power. The air around them thrummed with the signal, no longer a pressure but a resonance, a deep, vibrational hum that entered my very cells. My teeth ached, my skull vibrated. I stepped out of the car, my legs heavy, almost refusing to obey. A faint, phosphorescent glow emanated from the cracks in the stones, pulsing in time with the cosmic beat. As I approached the circle, the patterns on the stones resolved, not into carvings, but into an intricate living script that spoke of unimaginable distances, of eons folded upon themselves. My mind reeled. This was not a monument built by human hands. This was a gateway. It was a sea, and the stars were but foam on its surface. And within that sea, vast, slumbering entities stirred. I saw them not with my eyes, but with a new, terrifying clarity that tore through my sanity. They were not flesh and blood, not energy or matter as I understood it. They were concepts given form, geometries that defied Euclidean space, colors that had no names. My body convulsed. A searing pain shot through my skull, as if my brain were expanding, pushing against the confines of my bone. My vision fragmented, shattering into a million impossible perspectives. I saw the earth, a tiny blue marble, then a speck, then nothing, swallowed by the immensity. I saw the galaxy, a spinning pinwheel, then a swirl of dust, then an afterthought. I saw them, the true masters, stirring from their eons-long slumber, their awareness brushing against the fragile membrane of my reality. A scream tore from my throat, but it was not my own. It was a chorus of voices, ancient and alien, echoing through the vastness. The stone circle pulsed, its glow intensifying, becoming a blinding, ethereal light that consumed everything. The ground beneath me dissolved. The sky above me peeled back, revealing not space but an infinite churning chaos of impossible forms and colors. I was falling or rising or simply unmaking asterisk. My perception fractured completely. I was everywhere and nowhere, a whisper in the cosmic wind, a fleeting thought in a mind too vast to comprehend. The world had transformed. It was no longer the world I knew. It was a canvas for something else, something elder, something truly horrifying. What was left of Raj, the astrophysicist, in this new, alien reality?